What if the ground beneath Lebanon hides questions no century has fully answered? Across its valleys lie stones too large to move, yet clearly meant to be. Temples aligned with impossible precision, yet missing the stories that once gave them meaning. Cities built with purpose only to fall silent before their time. Who ordered such ambition? What halted it? And why do these structures still hold secrets, even after thousands of years of excavation? As each site rises from dust and shadow, the mystery deepens, inviting you to look closer, because the closer you get, the stranger the questions become. Baalbek. The vast plateau of Baalbek rises from the northern Bekaa Valley, with a kind of measured patience, its stones holding the memory of countless seasons as they catch the soft light that slips over the Lebanon mountains. And from the first approach, the scale of the Temple of Jupiter appears less as an isolated monument than as the lingering presence of generations, intent on shaping permanence out of limestone and time. The great columns, only 6 still standing, casting long shadows across a platform whose foundations descend into far older layers of occupation that blend Roman ambition with earlier cultural expressions of the region. The site unfolds slowly, revealing that the temple was never merely a sanctuary, but part of a deliberate architectural choreography. Its massive podium blocks, fitted with a precision that seems more practical than mysterious, yet invites questions about the labour forces, engineering methods, and political motivations behind such an undertaking in a highland town far from Rome's major centres. As the sun moves across the courtyards, the subtle asymmetries and weathered carvings point to long phases of construction, modification and reuse, hinting at the complexities of a place where Hellenistic and local traditions merged, before Roman architects expanded the complex into one of the largest cultic structures in the empire. Archaeologists have traced the route of ancient processions, inferred the ritual sequence from the surviving stairways and altars, and reconstructed how the towering columns once supported an immense entablature adorned with eagles and deities. Yet even with these reconstructions, the question remains why such monumental effort was anchored here rather than in a more politically central location. A curiosity that grows when considering the logistical challenges of transporting and lifting multi-ton stones at high elevation. The surviving reliefs whisper of imperial pageantry, of offerings and civic gatherings, and of the shifting identities of worshippers who adapted the sanctuary through late antiquity, leaving behind inscriptions that speak of devotion and local administration more than of grand myths. Still, the platform's immense size and the precision of its joints offer clues to both Roman engineering confidence and the regional stoneworking traditions that preceded it, creating a layered history in which each period is present, but none entirely explains the totality of the site. Excavations over the last century have identified earlier temples beneath the Roman podium, suggesting that the location carried spiritual significance long before Jupiter's cult rose to prominence. And these findings deepen the sense of continuity rather than reveal any abrupt or enigmatic break in architectural practice. Though the sheer scale of the later construction inevitably provokes questions about workforce organisation, quarrying logistics, and the administrative structures required to sustain such a project. The basalt and limestone fragments scattered around the precinct, the reused stones in medieval fortifications, and the gradual accumulation of sediments all testify to a landscape that has shifted materially and politically across millennia, reminding observers that much of Baalbek's story is reconstructed from partial evidence and careful inference. Yet, for all that scholarship has clarified the building techniques, the imperial context, the religious transformations, a quiet uncertainty remains in the way the surviving columns rise above the plain, suggesting not a lost civilization but a complex conversation across time, in which each generation added to an edifice whose original intentions are now grasped only through the fragments they left behind, leaving the temple of Jupiter poised between what can be measured with confidence and what can only be sensed in the vastness of its enduring stones. Temple of Eshmun. The Temple of Eshmun settles into the gentle slopes northeast of Sidon, where the Awali River once flowed in broader, more meandering channels, and the site's first impression is one of layered quietness, terraces rising subtly from the valley floor as though shaped as much by ritual movement as by architectural intent. Their limestone blocks, softened by centuries of water, earth, and shifting vegetation that have transformed a once flourishing healing sanctuary into a landscape of measured remnants. Approaching the complex reveals a sequence of platforms, stairways, and retaining walls that reflect a long architectural evolution, beginning in the Persian period and continuing through Hellenistic and Roman phases, each era adding structures without erasing what came before, resulting in a cumulative arrangement where altars, courtyards, and processional paths form a dialogue rather than a single unified plan. The healing cult of Eshmun, associated with health and regeneration, is evidenced by the presence of ritual basins, channels, and waterworks that guided the river's flow into constructed pools, and these features ground the sanctuary's purpose in the physical and symbolic use of water, a theme supported by inscriptions and decorative motifs found across the site, though the precise interplay between ritual bathing, votive offering, and symbolic purification remains understood only in broad strokes. Excavations have uncovered elegant votive sculptures, often depicting children or youthful figures, that hint at personal appeals for healing or protection, and their stylistic diversity reflects a sanctuary that remained active across multiple cultural horizons, adapting to changing artistic conventions while preserving core ritual associations that linked Eshmun to broader Phoenician and Mediterranean religious traditions. The monumental stairway, once flanked by colonnades, rises with a quiet dignity from the lower terrace toward what is believed to have been the central temple or shrine. Yet little of this primary structure survives in elevation, leaving archaeologists to reconstruct its form from foundations, column bases, and comparative examples from the region. This scarcity of architectural detail creates a fragmentary picture, one in which each stone offers clues, but no single element yields a complete architectural narrative. The presence of Roman additions, a curved nymphaeum, expanded water basins and decorative reliefs, suggests that the sanctuary continued to function long after its earliest phases, though perhaps with transformed meanings, as local traditions intertwined with imperial architectural preferences, creating a hybrid sacred landscape that defies simple categorization. The engineering behind the water systems is particularly notable. Channels carved into bedrock, brick-lined conduits, and the remains of hydraulic installations show careful planning to both harness and regulate the flow of the nearby river. Yet the exact configuration of the water rituals, whether continuous, seasonal, or event-based, remains a matter of interpretation, constrained by the limited survival of organic materials and written records. The terrace design itself implies a staged experience, perhaps guiding participants upward through increasingly sacred zones, though this interpretation remains cautious, grounded in the architectural rhythm rather than firm textual evidence. Throughout the sanctuary, carved blocks bearing Phoenician inscriptions provide glimpses into its administrative and religious functions, referencing dedications and construction phases that help anchor the site in historical context. Yet these texts are brief and selective, leaving many aspects of the sanctuary's operation unspoken. The surrounding landscape adds another dimension to the site's character. The slope of the valley, the proximity of fertile fields, and the steady presence of the river would have shaped both ritual practice and daily activity. And although modern modifications have altered the terrain, Archaeological sediment studies indicate that the ancient environment was wetter and more wooded, with the water table higher than it is today, suggesting that the sanctuary once sat within a greener, more fluid landscape, conducive to healing rites. Structural remains from the late antique and medieval periods show that the site continued to be reused in modest ways, its stones repurposed or reconfigured. And while these later interventions obscure some earlier features, they also highlight the sanctuary's long-term resilience as a recognizable focal point within the region. Fragments of architectural ornament, ionically carved capitals, relief panels, and portions of friezes hint at a decorative program now mostly lost there. Surviving details suggesting an aesthetic blending local traditions with imported motifs, a testament to Sidon's role as a cultural crossroads. The gradual collapse of terraces, especially during seismic episodes documented through geological studies, complicated the stratigraphy, yet these disruptions also preserved certain features beneath protective layers of rubble, allowing modern archaeology to recover elements that might otherwise have eroded away. Despite decades of excavation, the sanctuary's earliest phases remain only partially understood, constrained by limited textual sources and the difficulty of disentangling construction layers that overlap with minimal separation. The result is a site whose broad history is clear, but whose specific practices, architectural sequences, and ritual variations remain more suggestive than definitive. And it is this blend of clarity and incompleteness that gives the Temple of Eshmun its enduring quiet mystery. Not a puzzle born of extraordinary claims, but one shaped by the gaps inherent in a place used and reshaped across centuries, where healing pools once reflected the movement of worshippers, where terraces echoed with footsteps now lost, and where the surviving stones, though grounded firmly in their archaeological context, still leave space for reflection on the rituals and intentions that once animated this riverside sanctuary. Temple of Venus. The Temple of Venus curves gently outward from the southwestern edge of the Baalbek complex, its scalloped plan and graceful proportions forming a quiet counterpoint to the massive rectilinear forms of the larger sanctuaries. And as the visitor approaches, the remnants of its colonnade rise with an almost sculptural delicacy, suggesting an architectural language that once sought to harmonize ritual space with the contours of the surrounding landscape. Unlike the towering grandeur of the Jupiter and Bacchus temples, this smaller sanctuary appears to have been designed with a more intimate scale in mind, its horseshoe shape and subtly radiating walls reflecting a late Roman aesthetic that favoured fluid outlines and ornamental finesse, while the surviving Corinthian columns, though reduced in number, still carry traces of the carved acanthus leaves that once crowned the structure in a rhythmic sequence of light and shadow. Archaeologists have associated the temple with sacred traditions linked to Venus or Astarte, though the evidence remains carefully weighed rather than conclusive, as inscriptions and literary references are sparse, leaving researchers to rely primarily on architectural style and comparative studies across the region. This caution has kept interpretations grounded, recognizing that the site may have served multiple ritual functions across its lifespan. Excavation layers around the sanctuary reveal late antique modifications, including the addition of small Christian structures nearby, indicating that the area remained spiritually active long after the original temple lost its primary purpose. And these later adaptations complicate any attempt to assign the building a singular meaning, instead suggesting a landscape of shifting cultural expressions that reused and reinterpreted older sacred spaces. The temple's distinctive footprint, an almost shell-like sweep of walls, has invited speculation about its symbolic intentions, with some scholars proposing that it may have echoed regional artistic motifs or local cult narratives now largely lost. Yet such hypotheses remain tentative, grounded only in stylistic parallels rather than definitive evidence, and the ambiguity lends the structure a subtle historical reserve. The foundations themselves, constructed of smaller, carefully hewn blocks, rather than the colossal masonry seen elsewhere at Baalbek, point to a different engineering approach, one suited to the building's lighter superstructure and possibly reflecting the changing architectural priorities of the late Roman period, when ornamental refinement often replaced monumental scale. Weathering has softened the sharpness of many carvings, but enough detail remains to reveal a decorative program that once included niches, pilasters, and an array of mouldings that would have framed cult statues or offerings, creating a layered visual narrative that complemented the temple's flowing geometry. Yet without the upper portions of the structure, the full composition can only be inferred through surviving fragments and comparative reconstructions. The temple's placement within the wider sacred precinct adds another dimension to its mystery, positioned at a slight remove from the grand axial alignments of the main processional ways, suggesting that its rituals may have been more localized or specialized, though the absence of extensive textual records prevents firm conclusions. Over the centuries, the sanctuary endured periods of neglect, collapse, and reuse, and by the medieval era, much of its silhouette had already faded into the surrounding terrain, with later travellers describing it in partial ruins that nonetheless retained an air of unusual elegance within the broader complex. These accounts, along with archaeological surveys, reveal how shifting perceptions have shaped modern understanding of the site, and how each generation interpreted the remaining stones through the lens of its own historical knowledge. Excavations in the 20th century stabilized much of what survives today, allowing researchers to better document the architectural fragments. Yet the scarcity of datable artifacts, directly tied to the temple's earliest phases, means that its origins still rest on stylistic assessment more than definitive chronology, a reminder of the limits inherent in reconstructing ancient religious landscapes. The sanctuary's curved design, uncommon in the region, continues to prompt careful consideration, whether it reflected an imported architectural trend from other parts of the empire, a local adaptation shaped by cultural exchange, or a functional response to the terrain, is still debated, and the evidence remains open to multiple interpretations without straying into conjecture beyond what the material record can support. In the quiet that gathers around its remaining columns, the Temple of Venus conveys a different dimension of Baalbek's history. Not the colossal ambition of imperial Rome, nor the deep foundations of earlier Levantine traditions, but the subtle transitional moment when artistic experimentation, localized worship, and the shifting rhythms of late antiquity intersected, leaving behind a sanctuary whose fragmentary beauty offers insights without fully yielding its original purpose, allowing the structure to remain a contemplative presence, shaped as much by what survives as by all that has gently disappeared into time. Stone of the Pregnant Woman. The Stone of the Pregnant Woman rests in the quiet expanse of the southern Baalbek quarry, a single immense limestone block still partly attached to the bedrock, its weathered upper surface collecting stray grasses and late afternoon shadows, while its lower edges reveal the crisp, chiselling marks left by ancient masons who never completed its separation, leaving the stone as both artifact and unfinished endeavour within the broader narrative of Roman construction in the region. Measuring more than 20 metres in length, and weighing well over 1,000 tons, the block has long drawn attention not because its scale exceeds known Roman capabilities, but because its intended purpose, transport route, and ultimate abandonment remain only partially articulated through archaeological evidence, creating a subtle dialogue between craftsmanship and circumstance. Surveys of the quarry reveal a systematic approach, draft margins traced around the stone's perimeter, trenches carefully cut to isolate it from surrounding layers, and channels intended for wedges and levers, all of which align with established Roman quarrying methods seen across the empire, suggesting that the block size was not an anomaly, but part of a planned sequence of megalithic extraction meant to supply the Baalbek podium. Yet, despite the clarity of these technical details, the reason the stone was never moved remains uncertain, with possibilities ranging from miscalculations about its density or structural flaws to shifts in architectural design that made such a large monolith unnecessary, though each explanation is based on cautious inference rather than definitive evidence. Geological studies indicate that the limestone here forms extensive, high-quality strata capable of yielding exceptionally large blocks, and this natural availability may have encouraged quarry workers to cut monoliths at the upper limit of practicality, testing the boundaries of what the infrastructure, labour force and construction schedule at Baalbek could sustain. In this light, the stone's unfinished state may reflect pragmatic re-evaluation rather than any mysterious failure of technique. The quarry itself preserves traces of other megaliths in various stages of preparation, including stones that were completed and successfully transported to the temple complex, providing a broader context that frames the stone of the pregnant woman not as a singular enigma, but as one episode within a large-scale extraction operation that evolved over decades. Archaeologists studying soil compaction, ramp gradients, and possible sledging routes have reconstructed plausible pathways by which such stones could have been moved toward the sanctuary. And while these reconstructions remain hypothetical, they fit well within the known capabilities of Roman engineering, which regularly relied on coordinated labour, earthen embankments, and wooden sledges reinforced with ropes, rollers, or lubrication to shift massive weights across moderate distances. Still, the sheer magnitude of the stone introduces questions about whether its intended use lay within the visible trilithon level or in an even grander expansion phase that was ultimately abandoned, a consideration supported only by circumstantial relationships between quarry output and podium construction phases, leaving space for debate without inviting speculation beyond the material record. Later centuries layered new meanings onto the monolith's presence, as travellers assigned it names, stories, and interpretations shaped by their own eras, gradually transforming the unfinished stone into a cultural landmark distinct from its practical origins. Yet these later associations, while historically interesting, do not alter the archaeological understanding of its function within Baalbek's industrial landscape. Nearby discoveries, including even larger blocks such as the Stone of the South, reinforce the idea that the quarry operated at a scale far beyond conventional architectural needs, suggesting that Roman planners envisioned an expansion of Baalbek's platform that either shifted direction or exceeded the resources available, though the precise sequence remains fragmentary. The stone's edges retain subtle fractures and inclusions that may have influenced the decision to abandon it, as even minor imperfections could compromise the stability of a block intended for load-bearing placement in the podium. And this technical vulnerability, visible only upon close inspection, underscores the sensitivity required in selecting and shaping monoliths of such size. Over time, erosion softened its contours, soil accumulated along its flanks, and the once active quarry fell silent, leaving the monolith partly embedded in the earth and framed by shifting layers of sediment that preserve the imprint of ancient tools, even as they obscure portions of the original trench. Today, the stone of the pregnant woman stands less as an unsolved mystery than as a reminder of the practical decisions, ambitious planning, and complex labour dynamics that shaped Baalbek's monumental character. Its unfinished state offering a glimpse into a process where intention, geology, and evolving architectural priorities intersected in ways that remain only partially visible, allowing the block to embody a quiet, grounded enigma, one rooted not in the extraordinary, but in the subtle gaps between what was attempted, what was achieved, and what was ultimately set aside in the vast quarry fields of antiquity. Roman Baths of Beirut. The Roman Baths of Beirut rest quietly within the modern city's layered contours, their excavated foundations unfolding between glass facades and rising streets in a way that makes their ancient geometry feel both exposed and sheltered. A network of low walls, paved floors, and restored channels that hint at a once bustling complex where heat, water, and movement were arranged with the deliberate precision typical of Roman civic design. Approaching the site, one first notices the division of the bathhouse into recognizable components, the caldarium, tepidarium, and frigidarium, laid out along a subtle axial flow. Yet the surviving remains do not stand in isolation. Instead, they occupy the footprint of a public facility woven into the urban fabric of Roman Beirut, a city esteemed for its law school, and strategically placed along Mediterranean trade routes, suggesting that the baths served not only hygienic and recreational functions, but also social and administrative ones. Archaeologists have traced the hypocaust system's imprint across the floors, where rows of small brick pillars once lifted the paving stones to allow hot air to circulate from nearby furnaces. And the distribution of flues within the surviving walls shows an engineering logic consistent with other eastern provincial bathhouses, though the exact scale, height, and appearance of the superstructure remain partly conjectural due to the limited elevation of surviving masonry. The complex itself likely underwent several construction phases as the city expanded and recovered from periodic earthquakes, a fact supported by variations in brick size, mortar composition, and subtle differences in floor levels that hint at repairs, enhancements, or partial reconstructions across centuries of use. Inscriptions and literary references to Beirut's civic life paint a picture of a city that valued public spaces deeply. And although none explicitly describe this particular bathhouse, the archaeological evidence, its central location near other administrative buildings, suggests it played a role in daily rhythms that blended relaxation, discussion, and the practical routines of urban society. Excavations in the late 20th century revealed layers of destruction consistent with seismic events known from historical sources, their collapsed roof tiles and fragmented masonry providing a chronological anchor that helps align the baths with broader patterns of urban decline and renewal. Yet these layers also obscure earlier phases, making the site a palimpsest where each generation left both traces and absences. The water system, partially exposed, reveals channels likely fed by aqueducts or cisterns situated farther upslope. And the surviving conduits show how carefully temperature gradients were managed, though the exact layout of the upper heating chambers is reconstructed primarily through parallels at sites like Hamat Garda and other regional complexes. The presence of polished stone fragments, bits of mosaic, and imported marble veneers indicates that the baths once held a refined aesthetic, even if only fragments now hint at the decorative program that shaped visitors' experience. And these details suggest a civic investment in public architecture consistent with Beirut's status within the Roman and later Byzantine world. Yet the site also reflects the transitions that followed antiquity, the accumulation of medieval debris, the repurposing of stones into nearby structures, and the gradual burying of the bathhouse beneath the expanding city all speak to changing urban priorities, making the baths both a preserved relic and a recovered absence within the historical landscape. Nearby finds, coins, pottery, and small personal items provide glimpses of daily life around the complex, but stop short of revealing the full experience of those who frequented it, leaving archaeologists to approximate patterns of use through wear marks, drainage gradients, and architectural comparisons, rather than through direct textual documentation. The juxtaposition of different construction materials, sandstone blocks, fired brick, hydraulic plaster, offers insight into the technical choices made across the building's long history, though these materials complicate precise dating, since repairs often reused older stone alongside newer mortar, blurring the boundaries between periods. As the modern city rose above the ruins, the baths lay concealed beneath layers of fill until systematic excavations uncovered their footprint. And once revealed, their integration into contemporary Beirut created a dialogue between the ancient and the present, emphasizing the site not simply as a relic of Rome, but as part of a continuous urban story shaped by cycles of destruction and reconstruction. The careful restoration of pathways and interpretive features allowed the bathhouse's geometry to be read more clearly. Yet even with this framing, many aspects remain open to interpretation. The precise dimensions of vanished vaults, the arrangement of service corridors, and the rhythms of heating cycles must be inferred from surviving walls and analogues rather than directly observed. Geological studies of the surrounding terrain reveal that ancient Beirut's shoreline and water table were different from today, suggesting that the baths once stood closer to a more accessible freshwater network, and within a city grid shaped by environmental conditions, now altered by centuries of urban development. And this environmental shift complicates efforts to reconstruct how water was sourced, heated, and cycled through the complex. Though the bathhouse fits comfortably within the broader tradition of Roman public architecture, its partial survival gives it a distinctive character, one in which absence plays as significant a role as presence. Missing upper stories, vanished pools, and lost ornamentation create interpretive silences that frame but do not overshadow what can be known, allowing the site to remain grounded within archaeological method, while retaining an understated aura of incompleteness. Standing within the exposed foundations, with modern buildings rising around the ancient walls, the Roman baths of Beirut evoke a sense of continuity, shaped not by mystery in the extraordinary sense, but by the gentle uncertainties that accompany any site layered by time. The quiet traces of heating channels, the fragmentary outlines of rooms once warm with steam, and the enduring suggestion of a public space that served generations, whose movements can still be felt in the stones, even if their full stories remain just beyond the reach of the surviving record. Anjar ruins. The ruins of Anjar stretch across the Bacchus plain in a measured grid of limestone walls and colonnaded avenues, their orderly layout emerging with a clarity unusual for sites in the region. For this was a planned Umayyad city rather than a settlement that grew organically, its geometric precision offering a rare glimpse into an early 8th century urban vision that was both administrative and commercial in character, yet now softened by centuries of abandonment, wind-blown dust, and the slow encroachment of orchards along its perimeter. Approaching the site, the straight lines of the Cardo and Decumanus intersect at a careful right angle, framing a cityscape influenced by the late antique architectural vocabulary that the Umayyads adapted to their own needs, and the proportions of streets, shops, palaces and residential quarters suggest a landscape designed to manage the movement of goods and people at a strategic crossroads between inland Syria and Mediterranean ports. Excavations have revealed foundations of workshops, storerooms, and domestic spaces arranged with a consistency that speaks to deliberate planning. Yet the city's lifespan appears to have been brief, interrupted by political shifts and possibly by changes in regional trade networks, leaving behind a settlement whose grand intentions outlasted its period of active use. The Great Palace, with its spacious courtyard and arcaded facades, hints at a mixture of ceremonial and administrative functions, its fragments of carved stone and reused Roman elements displaying the transitional artistry of an era when Islamic architectural forms were still coalescing from earlier Mediterranean and Near Eastern traditions. The smaller palace nearby, more compact yet elegantly proportioned, reinforces the sense of a governing presence meant to manage both the movement of caravans and the agricultural productivity of the fertile plain. Water systems uncovered beneath the city reveal channels and cisterns that supplied baths, garden spaces and residential quarters, though the precise arrangement of these hydraulic features remains partially reconstructed due to missing upper structures and later disturbances. Still, their traces indicate that Anjar relied on a carefully managed supply, likely drawn from nearby springs, and distributed through engineered conduits adapted from late antique models. The city's colonnades, though now reduced to skeletal rows of bases and partially preserved shafts, once created shaded corridors along the main streets, aligning markets and public spaces in a pattern reminiscent of older Roman and Byzantine towns. Yet the materials used, lighter limestone, smaller carved blocks, point to local resources and to construction methods adjusted to the needs of an emerging administrative centre rather than an imperial capital. Finds from within shops and domestic structures, ceramics, glass and small metal objects, confirm that the city engaged in trade typical of the early Islamic period. Though these artifacts provide only glimpses of daily life, their distribution suggesting concentrated activity along the main avenues, while peripheral areas may have been more sparsely inhabited or still under development when the city's occupation waned. Historical sources, though limited, associate Anjar with the Umayyad Caliph al-Walid or his successors, and this attribution aligns with both the architectural style and the archaeological dating of the site. Yet the written record remains too sparse to fully explain why the city was founded here, why it followed such an unusually regular plan, or why it was eventually abandoned, leaving scholars to balance reasonable interpretations with an acknowledgement of the gaps that remain. The defensive wall surrounding the settlement, strengthened by towers at intervals, suggests that the city held strategic importance, perhaps as a waypoint along regional routes, or as a guarded administrative hub overseeing the Bacchus's agricultural output, though the evidence does not firmly establish whether it faced specific military threats or simply followed standard urban design conventions of the period. Earthquakes, known to have affected the region, may have contributed to structural instability. Yet, archaeological layers indicate more of a gradual cessation of activity than a sudden destructive event, and the absence of significant rebuilding suggests that Anjar's decline was tied more to political and economic changes following the fall of the Umayyads than to any specific catastrophe. Over centuries, parts of the site were quarried for stone, and agricultural activity altered the surrounding terrain. Yet enough architectural fabric survived to allow modern excavations to reconstruct its careful symmetry, revealing not only palatial complexes and workshops, but also a mosque whose foundations, though simple, anchor the city's role as a functioning Islamic settlement. The blend of spolia, older Roman or Byzantine blocks incorporated into the new construction, adds another layer to the site's narrative, illustrating both practical reuse and the transitional aesthetics of an era when builders drew upon available materials while developing evolving artistic expressions. As archaeologists mapped the grid, they noted slight irregularities in alignment and variations in construction techniques that hint at phases of rapid building or shifts in workforce organization. And these nuances soften the impression of perfect regularity, revealing a city shaped by both careful planning and the realities of execution. The surrounding landscape, framed by the anti-Lebanon mountains and the distant view of Mount Hermon, contextualizes the city within a corridor long used for movement and exchange, and sediment studies indicate that the ancient environment was similar to today's, but perhaps more intensively cultivated during the city's occupation, providing resources to support its population. Despite the clarity of its layout, Anjar still carries an understated mystery. Its purpose broadly understood, Yet its specific administrative role, its brief fluorescence, and its quiet decline only partially illuminated by surviving evidence, leaving the city's grid to stand not only as an example of early Islamic urban planning, but also as a reminder of how even well-preserved ruins hold spaces of uncertainty. In walking through its colonnaded streets and open courtyards, one senses both the precision of its design and the silence of its unfinished story. A settlement whose stones describe the framework of a life once intended to thrive here, even as the reasons for its creation and its abandonment remain gently unresolved within the archaeological record. Tyre al-Bas Archaeological Site. The Tyre al-Bas archaeological site spreads across a quiet stretch of the ancient city's eastern outskirts, where a broad necropolis, a long Roman road, and the remains of one of the grandest hippodromes in the Levant lie arranged in a landscape shaped by shifting shorelines, sediment drift, and centuries of urban retreat. Their forms weathered, but still coherent enough to evoke the rhythms of a city that once balanced maritime power with inland reach. Entering the precinct, the road reveals itself first. A colonnaded artery paved with large limestone slabs that bear the faint grooves of carts, long vanished. The alignment leading toward monumental gateways that once defined the transition from the living city to its funerary outskirts, and along its edges lie sarcophagi carved in various styles, Roman, late antique and regional, reflecting a long tradition of burial practices adapted over time rather than any single funerary custom. The necropolis extends irregularly to either side, its tombs cut into bedrock or constructed with masonry, some adorned with reliefs or inscriptions that anchor individual stories within the broader civic identity of ancient Tyre, though many remain mute, their occupants unnamed, and their ritual details known only through comparison with better documented sites. Continuing along the road, the hippodrome comes gradually into view, its elongated oval footprint emerging from grass and stone, with a clarity shaped by both endurance and loss. Although only partial seating tiers survive, and much of the superstructure has vanished, enough remains to reconstruct the grand scale of the races once held here, events that likely carried political, communal, and ceremonial significance within a city renowned for its maritime influence and its connections across the Mediterranean. Archaeologists studying the hippodrome's masonry have noted the interplay of large ashlar blocks, reused stones and local construction techniques, suggesting multiple building phases that aligned the structure with Tyre's evolving civic fortunes, while the spina, the central barrier that once guided chariot paths, survives only in faint outlines, its absence inviting careful reconstruction rather than certainty. The adjacent bath complex, though more fragmented, reveals traces of hypocauste channels, pools and service corridors, hinting at a network of public amenities that once complemented the athletic and ceremonial functions of the larger precinct. And these remains underscore the integrated nature of Roman urban planning, even in coastal cities whose identities extended far beyond their inland monuments. Water systems uncovered throughout the site show channels and clay pipes that once directed water from inland sources, a reminder that Tyre's ancient topography differed from the modern shoreline, with shifting coastlines gradually altering both the city's reach and the context in which these structures once operated. Sediment studies indicate that parts of the precinct were more open and less affected by encroaching sands during antiquity, a detail that reshapes modern perceptions of how the hippodrome and road originally related to the surrounding terrain. Yet for all the clarity offered by architectural remains, the overall layout raises subtle questions. The exact sequence of construction, the degree to which the necropolis expanded or contracted over time, and the integration of the hippodrome within the city's ceremonial life remain topics informed by material evidence but not entirely settled, since each phase of use left traces that overlap and occasionally obscure earlier ones. Inscriptions found on sarcophagi provide glimpses of identity, names, professions, dedications. Yet these fragments frame only part of the community, and the absence of extensive textual records from Tyre's civic archives leaves aspects of its social structure and funerary customs only partly illuminated. The Roman road itself, with its alignment leading toward the city's interior, suggests a carefully planned approach meant to organize both everyday traffic and ritual movement. But the degree to which formal processions occurred along this route remains uncertain, inferred primarily from parallels in better documented provincial cities. Over time, earthquakes, coastal shifts, and urban contraction buried large portions of the precinct beneath layers of sand and debris, preserving some elements while eroding others, and the modern excavation process had to disentangle centuries of mixed deposits before the site's contours could be recognized with any clarity. Even with careful study, questions persist about the transitions from Roman to Byzantine and later periods, whether the hippodrome was modified for new uses, whether the necropolis. Boundaries shifted, and how local communities interacted with these monumental spaces after their original functions diminished. The site's present openness, its long views across broken seating tiers, scattered sarcophagi, and the gently curving outline of the stadium, invites a sense of measured continuity rather than abrupt mystery, grounded in the extensive archaeological record, yet still marked by the inevitable silences left by incomplete preservation. In this balance of evidence and absence, the Tyre al-Bas precinct conveys the quiet complexity of a city that once bridged maritime networks and inland landscapes. Its surviving roads, tombs, and arenas, offering insights into a layered civic identity, while leaving enough unspoken to remind the observer that even in well-studied sites, portions of the ancient experience remain just beyond reach, shaped by the interplay of what time preserved and what it allowed to fade. Trilithon stones. The Trilithon stones emerge from the western retaining wall of the Temple of Jupiter's vast platform, with a weight and stillness that appear almost geological rather than architectural. Three immense limestone blocks, set in place so precisely that their joints form faint, unwavering seams, despite each stone measuring over 20 meters in length and weighing several hundred tons. And as the viewer moves along the terrace, the scale gradually resolves, not as an isolated feat of construction, but as part of a much larger and layered foundation system built to stabilize the sanctuary above. Their presence has long drawn quiet curiosity. For while Roman engineering is fully capable of explaining the techniques, levering, ramp systems, coordinated labor, their exceptional size invites questions about why such blocks were selected when smaller, more manageable stones could have achieved the same structural purpose. And it is this tension between straightforward method and unusual choice that gives the Trilithon its enduring intrigue. Archaeological surveys show that the stones form only one tier of an even more complex podium, with courses of similarly large blocks beneath and around them, indicating a coherent architectural strategy rather than an isolated anomaly. Yet the decision to incorporate such extraordinary dimensions remains only partially understood, likely influenced by a combination of local quarrying traditions, the availability of high-quality limestone nearby, and the symbolic value of visibly monumental foundations in a sanctuary meant to project imperial authority. The quarry from which these stones were extracted lies just south of the site, linked by a gentle slope that would have facilitated transport, and within it, researchers have identified multiple half-finished megaliths that provide insight into Roman extraction techniques, drafted margins chiseled around their perimeters, trenches used to isolate them from the bedrock, and the earlier stages of shaping that mirror the blocks set into the podium. Yet these evidence-based observations depict an industrious workshop rather than a mysterious manufacturing process. Still, the Trilithon's placement raises logistical considerations that remain only partly reconstructed. The coordination of hundreds of labourers, the careful grading of earthen ramps, and the synchronized use of rollers or sledges capable of distributing weight evenly across soil that had to be compacted and maintained throughout the operation, all of which fall well within known Roman capabilities, but nonetheless represent a major undertaking for a highland site far from the empire's most industrialized centres. Some scholars have proposed that earlier local traditions of large stone construction may have influenced Roman choices, pointing to pre-Roman phases at Baalbek and other Levantine sites where sizable blocks appear in foundational contexts, though the evidence for a direct lineage remains cautious, emphasizing continuity of stoneworking expertise in the region rather than any abrupt technological divergence. Geological studies show that the limestone used for the Trilithon blocks is consistent with nearby quarry strata, which helps explain the decision to use such pieces as single monoliths rather than subdivide them. Working with naturally large, fault-free segments may have been more efficient for the builders despite the transportation difficulty. And this practical reasoning adds nuance to interpretations that focus solely on symbolic or aesthetic motives. The retaining wall around the Trilithon exhibits carefully finished faces, drafted margins, and a subtle batter that reinforces stability across the entire platform. And the engineering logic of these details aligns with Roman construction norms, offering a grounded framework for understanding how such massive blocks fit into a much broader structural plan that relied not only on weight, but on calculated geometry and interlocking courses to support the sanctuary above. Even with these technical explanations, the Trilithon remains quietly perplexing in its ambition, prompting researchers to consider the administrative priorities that would have justified the additional time, labour, and resources required for such stones. Whether driven by imperial patronage, local prestige, or the desire to create a sanctuary that rivaled other major temples of the Roman East, the decision reflects a confidence in both manpower and engineering that becomes clearer in light of the many large-scale projects undertaken by the empire during the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE. Over centuries of seismic activity, the blocks have shifted only minimally, a testament to the stability of their placement and the skill of the builders who set them. Yet these subtle movements have provided useful information for modern geologists studying the region's earthquake history, revealing how ancient masonry mass responds to long-term tectonic forces. Later travellers, medieval chroniclers, and early modern scholars each approach the Trilithon with varying degrees of speculation, often interpreting their scale through the lens of the knowledge available in their eras. And while many early accounts introduced imaginative explanations, contemporary archaeology has grounded the discussion in measurable evidence, aligning the stones with known Roman practices while still acknowledging aspects of their purpose that remain open to thoughtful inquiry. Excavations around the retaining wall continue to refine understanding of the construction sequence, revealing that the platform evolved through multiple phases, some earlier than the Trilithon level and others added after, creating a palimpsest of engineering decisions shaped by changing architectural plans rather than a single unified blueprint. In the quiet that settles along the western terrace at dusk, the Trilithon stones take on a subtle presence that reflects both the clarity and the uncertainty inherent in studying them. On one hand, they stand as clear evidence of Roman engineering capability, traceable to quarries, tools and techniques that are well attested. On the other, their exceptional size, their deliberate inclusion in the platform's most visible retaining wall, and the absence of written records explaining the rationale behind such choices, introduce a gentle ambiguity, leaving the observer with a sense that the true motivation, whether practical, symbolic, or simply a reflection of the ambitions of those who oversaw Baalbek's monumental expansion, remains just beyond reach, preserved in the stone itself, but not fully disclosed by the fragments of history that surround it. Temple of Bacchus. The Temple of Bacchus stands just to the south of its larger counterpart, yet feels unexpectedly intimate as one steps into its long, narrow footprint, the exterior walls rising in a near unbroken cliff of stone, whose deeply carved Corinthian pilasters seem to hold the afternoon light in their flutes. And within this enclosure, the interplay of shadow and relief hints at the careful artistry that Roman builders brought to Baalbek when they expanded the sanctuary into a multi-tiered complex of extraordinary refinement. Although smaller than the Temple of Jupiter, it remains one of the best preserved Roman temples in the world, and its survival allows a rare sense of continuity as the interior unfolds. A broad pronaos leading into a richly ornamented cellar, where vine motifs, mythological scenes, and architectural mouldings converge in an arrangement that conveys both ceremonial grandeur and a measured rhythm of movement. Archaeologists have long debated the temple's exact ritual sequence and the degree to which Bacchus was worshipped locally as a distinct deity or as a syncretic expression, blending Roman, Hellenistic, and regional traditions. And the surviving reliefs, festivals, grapes, ceremonial vessels, offer clues that are evocative but not definitive, suggesting that the cult could have been both celebratory and civic, tied as much to communal identity as to mythic narrative. The building techniques visible in the temple's high foundations, drafted margins, and precisely set blocks reflect an engineering approach consistent with Roman practice across the eastern Mediterranean. Yet the surrounding context, its proximity to older layers, the orientation of its platform, the relationship to the courtyards and altars, adds complexities that have led some scholars to propose earlier sacred structures on the same spot, even though the evidence remains fragmentary. The temple's roof, now largely missing, once amplified the spatial drama, filtering light in ways that emphasize the carved capitals and the monumental doorway, decorated with an intricately worked keystone showing an eagle framed by floral ornamentation. And although portions of this entrance have collapsed, the surviving elements still convey the precision and ambition that characterized the complex during its peak in the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE. Over the centuries, earthquakes, shifting political powers, and the gradual repurposing of stone shaped the temple's condition. Yet its essential form has remained surprisingly intact, allowing modern researchers to analyze proportions, acoustics, and decorative programs with a clarity rarely available in structures of similar age. Beneath the visible layers, excavations have uncovered traces of late antique adaptation, small changes in floor use, and the insertion of modest installations whose purposes are interpreted cautiously, as they likely reflect the temple's long transformation rather than any single moment of upheaval. Even so, the building's preservation raises quiet questions about why this particular sanctuary endured, while others nearby suffered more extensive loss, prompting considerations that range from local maintenance practices to broader historical circumstances that favoured its continued relevance. In this way, the Temple of Bacchus stands as both an architectural achievement and a subtle historical puzzle, a structure whose remarkably complete state allows much to be known, yet inevitably leaves space for reflection on how ritual, community, and landscape once converged within its walls, the intricate carvings and enduring silence, inviting a sense of curiosity that remains grounded in the evidence, while acknowledging all that still lies just beyond certainty. Stone of the South. The Stone of the South lies deeper within the Baalbek quarry, larger still than its more famous neighbour, and resting in a shallow, sloping cut, where its immense length, exceeding 20 metres, reveals the full extent of the ancient ambition that shaped this industrial landscape, its upper surface gently tilting with the terrain, while its lower edges remain sharply defined by the parallel trenches that ancient workers carved with deliberate repetitive strokes. This monolith, estimated to weigh well over 1,000 tons, and perhaps approaching the limits of what could realistically be, moved along the gradual incline toward the temple platform, appears to represent an advanced stage of extraction, in which the block had already been isolated on 3 sides, leaving only a thin bed of limestone beneath it to be removed before the stone could be freed. A process that archaeological analysis suggests was interrupted rather than abandoned at a planned endpoint. Tool marks preserved along the trench walls indicate that Roman quarrymen employed chisels and picks in a rhythmic sequence aimed at freeing the block systematically. And these marks match those found on other successfully transported stones that now sit within the Baalbek podium, reinforcing that the stone of the south belonged to the same engineering logic, rather than to any exceptional or unknown technique. Geological surveys of the quarry show that the limestone bed here is unusually thick, uniform, and relatively free of major fissures, offering conditions ideal for extracting oversized monoliths. Thus, the stone's extraordinary size likely reflects not an attempt at something unprecedented, but the pragmatic use of available high-quality material shaped to meet evolving architectural plans for the sanctuary's expanding foundations. Yet, the monolith's enormous mass raises practical questions about the precise logistical threshold the builders intended to reach, as the proposed transport path, gradually rising toward the monumental complex, would have required significant earthworks, highly coordinated labour, and constant maintenance of compacted soil roots to support such weight. And while these methods are well attested in Roman engineering, they provide only partial insight into why such a massive block was cut if its movement would be so demanding. Some researchers have suggested that slight irregularities visible on the stone's underside or small veins within the limestone may have influenced a later decision to halt the extraction, since even minor imperfections could compromise structural performance if the block were destined for a load-bearing position within the podium. Others point to shifts in construction priorities, noting that the platform underwent multiple phases of expansion and redesign, and the stone of the south may simply have belonged to a building plan that was modified or scaled back before the block was completed, a scenario consistent with the quarry's evidence of stones left in various states of preparation. The relationship between this monolith and the larger complex becomes clearer when examining the wider quarry floor, where smaller blocks, half-finished stones and extraction trenches form a mosaic of interrupted tasks, suggesting that the site functioned as a dynamic industrial zone responsive to ongoing architectural decisions rather than as the product of a single unified project. Even so, the stone of the south retains a quiet presence that differentiates it from purely utilitarian remains, for its sheer scale, so close to completion yet never moved, captures a moment in which the ambitions of Baalbek's builders brushed the edge of practical feasibility, leaving behind a monolith that simultaneously reflects technical confidence and the prudent reassessment that accompanies large-scale construction. Over centuries, soil accumulation partially buried its lower surfaces, vegetation softened its edges, and the quarry's once active contours blurred into the surrounding landscape, yet the stone's position remained stable, undisturbed by the seismic events that reshaped other parts of the region, allowing its unfinished form to survive with remarkable clarity. Modern excavations have further exposed its dimensions, showing how closely its measurements align with the Trilithon level blocks already incorporated into the platform, strengthening the view that the stone's intended role was part of a cohesive structural strategy rather than an isolated or experimental endeavour. Standing beside it, the absence of any explicit ancient record explaining the reasons behind its abandonment creates a gentle space for reflection, not one filled with speculation, but rather with the recognition that construction at this scale involved shifting. Assessments, rigorous planning, and adaptive decision-making that occasionally left large undertakings incomplete. In this sense, the stone of the south holds its place within the quarry not as an enigma beyond explanation, but as a testament to the complex interplay of geology, engineering, and architectural change. Its unfinished state offering a glimpse into the practical realities of ancient craftsmanship and the quiet uncertainties that persist when the material record preserves the outcome but not the motivations of those who shaped it.